Welcome everybody. My name's Kirsten Whitfield and I'm a Director in Fieldfisher's Privacy, Security and Information Law team. And I'm joined by Sabba Mirza, who is a Senior Associate in our team. This is part of our Get Data Protection Fit series. So the series has already taken you through Module 1 and the fundamentals of data protection law. And we moved on to Module 2A, putting data protection into practice. And this is segment 5 of Module 2A. So we are looking at data incident, data breach, SOS. What do you need to do? By the end of this session, you should be able to prepare for a breach and deal with a data breach when it happens. First, we're going to look at how do you prepare for a breach. So we'll take a look at what the GDPR says you need to do, and then some practical steps for preparation. Then we're going to look at the key steps involved in incident response and impacts of a breach. So what does the GDPR say? So there are the data breach notification requirements in the GDPR, and you'll find those in Articles 33 and 34. But underpinning that, there's the security measure requirement. So the GDPR requires you to have in place adequate security to protect personal data. That's technical and organizational measures. So that's Article 32. So underpinning everything, there's this security requirement. Then there's also requirements around employees, contractors, and processors. So these are the parties that may well have access to your personal data. And there's requirements in Article 29, 32.4, and Article 28. So Article 28 is that's the contractual requirements you need to have in place with your processors. And 29 and 32.4, that's around making sure that those employees and contractors that have access to the data are actually only doing with it what they should be doing for you, what you want them to do, and nothing else. Then there's the data protection by design and default provisions to think about as well. So this is about making sure that you build in data protection from the ground up. So looking at it from the perspective of your projects and systems, how are they data protection compliant? How are they secure? What security measures have you put in place? Then there's the data protection impact assessment requirements as well. And part of that will also be security and assessing, looking at whether you've got adequate security. So there's a whole bunch of measures in the round that tie together that will touch on security, that to prepare yourselves you need to be thinking about. Then before we go any further, let's have a look at what the GDPR says a personal data breach actually is. So the definition is here it's Article 4.12 of the GDPR, and we've reproduced it here on the slide. So a personal data breach is a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. Now, the thing to bear in mind here is that you might well have an incident of, say, accidental disclosure. So someone sent pay slips to the wrong person. That's a fairly obvious personal data breach, but there are also less obvious personal data breaches. If, say, you have a ransomware attack and your data is no longer available, that actually is also a personal data breach, because a personal data breach extends to your being able to access the personal data. So I've touched on this in a bit of detail just to highlight that a personal data breach could actually cover more incidents than you might think, and certainly more incidents than your IT or security departments might be thinking are personal data breaches. So moving on to how you prepare for a breach. So there are practical steps that we wanted to talk you through, and we've divided this up into roughly 4 parts. So there's the policy framework, there's the business processes that underpin the policy framework, There's the reviewing and improving, so that is the continually evolving and getting better at dealing with breaches. And then there's the awareness and training internally. So let's start with the policy framework. So this really is your documentation. And we've divided that up into policies, templates, and then other tools and resources that you might want to have ready to hand. So from a policies perspective, policies such as your incident response, so this is a policy on how you're going to respond to an incident, and that would be mainly aimed at your breach team. Incident reporting, so that's a policy which would be aimed at the wider staff population and which tells them effectively what they need to be reporting to you and how they do that. Your information security policies will also be the underpinning framework, and acceptable use policies will also be helpful in terms of underpinning security requirements and what people should and shouldn't be doing. Templates that you might want to have ready are things like sample breach notification letters that might need to go to data subjects. Now, it's very difficult to draft for those because all sorts of different things can happen, so you might need to say different things in those letters, but it is possible to have a framework letter, a starting point to get on with. Legal hold letters might be useful to have those on the stocks. Sample announcements, so the internal ones, if you say had a breach happen that you need to let employees know about so they know what's going on, and also say not to talk to the press, you might want to have a sample internal announcement ready on the books. And then also scripts for talking to the media and for other external communications, so things you might put on your website or press statements that you might make. So in terms of other tools and resources, it might also be a good idea to have FAQs at the ready. So if a breach happens, people tend to have lots of questions. So you could prepare some sample FAQs for different types of breaches. It's helpful to have a overview of what the notification requirements are in different countries. So particularly if you operate across multiple countries or have data that comes from multiple countries, understanding what your breach notification requirements are, not just under the GDPR, but locally as well, can be very helpful, and having that information at your fingertips to access quickly is very helpful. Even basic things like having contact details of the breach team, the internal breach team that is, having access to contracts and contact details for external experts. So often, if a material breach happens, you might need external legal or you might need a forensics provider to help with investigating. It's a good idea to have arrangements and contracts already set up so you can quickly call on those experts and not have to be first negotiating a contract with them before they step in to help out. It's also good to make sure you've got your breach log and record at the ready. Now, you should have this anyway, so it's a GDPR requirement that you keep a record of personal data breaches. That's not just the ones that get notified to regulators and data subjects, that's all of them. So it's good to have that handy, A, so that you can update the log, but B, it's also useful to look back over and see what you've done in other instances. And having your data mapping records handy is also very useful. So if you have say a fairly material breach and you need to understand what information is held where and who has access to it, to understand how severe the breach is, then if you've already done your data mapping and have a lot of this information mapped out, those data mapping records will be absolutely critical. Then underpinning all of your policies and documentation, you also need to have the business processes in place and they need to work. So, have identified all of your key stakeholders, and that ties into what I was saying earlier about experts, but also, who are all of your internal experts that need to be involved. And also make sure you've got your breach reporting channels set up. So if something happens that you need to know about, how are staff going to contact you and how they're going to know to contact you? How will your processors know to contact you and where to contact you if they suffer an incident? Or what about your customers if something happens to their data and they suspect it could impact you as a provider? And also other third parties. So it might be that someone comes across the information that belongs to your organization and it's there on the internet and they want to tell you about it so you can do something about it. How can they get in touch with you? Then also think about who the reporting is to. So in terms of internal breach reporting, your breach team, your security teams, management, the board, what are all the reporting channels and communications channels? Then how are you going to do your reporting to regulators and who does that? Reporting to data subjects, notifications if you need to make them. Who's going to do that? Are you set up to do that? Would you be able to contact your data subjects? And others like insurers and your customers that may be controllers. If you're the processor, do you need to notify them as well? So have all of your processes in place so that you can quickly make sure that you're disseminating information as well if you need to. Moving on now to the reviewing and improving phase. This is a critical phase as well. These sorts of processes and policies and how you deal with incidents is a constantly evolving thing, and there's always improvements to make. So, have workshops, identify policy and process improvements and build them in, and also look at your breach team. Were you missing any key components? And finally, the fourth of the building blocks is training, and it's making sure that the breach team know what they're doing, and it's not ideal if they're learning in the context of an actual breach. So it's a good idea to do mock incidents to prepare the breach team, and staff as well to make sure that they have an understanding of what a personal data breach is, and they're getting all the right training. Things like phishing attacks and spotting them, do mock phishing attacks, they're very helpful, and make sure they get training on personal data breach reporting as well. And then in terms of awareness, wall posters, newsletters, intranet, there's all sorts of ways, but just it's ways to try and make sure that this is all kept in the forefront of people's minds.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm now going to take you all through the key steps in the incident response process. As you can see on this slide, there are 10 key steps in this process. A key thing to note at this stage is that one step doesn't necessarily then lead to the other. You may be dealing with 2 or 3 of these steps simultaneously when dealing with a breach in practice. The first step is detecting that an incident has taken place. Broadly speaking, there's 2 key ways in which this could be done. The first is through reporting. You could have a member of staff, even a bad actor, ethical hackers, customers, your processors, other data controllers, or general members of the public notify a breach to you and bring that to your attention. It would then be from this point that your 72-hour clock starts, provided you've established a breach at that point. The second way in which you can detect a breach is through technology. You may have various system logs, intrusion detection functionality in place, and data loss prevention systems, which may raise a red flag in the event that someone has attempted to access your system when they're not authorized to do so, or whether large volumes of data have been exported from your systems. The second stage when dealing with a data breach is to investigate and contain the breach. The first thing you would do is convene your incident response team, and this would consist of the key stakeholders that were listed earlier in slide 11. They could include legal, compliance, your data privacy team, IT, HR, your customer support team. It really depends on the nature of the breach as to who will form part of your incident response team. The second thing that you would need to do is obviously commence the investigation. For this, you may carry out forensics or interview the individuals involved in the breach. Lastly, you would need to implement measures to prevent continuation, such as password changes, removing data, or taking off the data off a website where it's accessed by the wider public, assess access controls, and amend and fix software glitches. The third stage of the incident response process is to preserve evidence, and in order to assist you with this, you may engage forensics experts. Alternatively, if you have the capability in-house, you may elect to rely on your in-house IT security team for this. It's very important when investigating an incident that you actually know what went wrong and exactly what data has been compromised, and preserving evidence is key in achieving this. A way in which you can do this is creating an image of your systems at the point that the breach occurred and prior to you implementing measures to actually remove the unauthorized access and amend security. Another way in which this can be achieved is by preserving system logs. And system logs would show when a bad actor has had unauthorized access to your system and when that system was revoked, and during that time whether they have done anything unauthorized with the data, such as make copies or downloads. You may also put a legal hold on your various documentation at this stage. Before I move on and talk about the risk assessment stage of the data breach process, it is also worth noting that in Kirsten and mine experience about dealing with data breaches, we have often found that clients are actually let down by not having any access logs in place or system logs in place, or having system logs which are inadequate and do not provide the granular detail required to assess whether a bad actor has actually accessed the data concerned and whether they've actually downloaded it. In these situations, what ends up happening is that when a notification to the regulator is made, our clients often have to assume the worst case scenario, and in any event, they are not able to confirm whether the data had actually been accessed or downloaded by the bad actor or not. Now, moving on to risk assessment. The first diagram on this slide sets out the various factors that you need to consider when assessing the risk to the affected individual. What we have also provided here is an example, and this is an extract from our risk assessment. And the risk assessment guidance document that we have developed is based on guidance from the European Data Protection Board and ENISA on assessing risk in the event of a breach. As part of the data breach incident response process, you would also need to consider how to mitigate harm to the affected individual. This could be done in a variety of ways, and these essentially point to, broadly speaking, the various security measures that you have in place. That's why we have also stated that at this point you may consider updating or improving them. One way in which you can mitigate harm to the individual is to change passwords and access controls, particularly where you have had a case of unauthorized access to their data. Another way in which this could be achieved is to recover the compromised data. For example, if you have inadvertently sent personal data to a third party who wasn't authorized to see it, you should, as a controller, take steps to recover that data from that third party. Lastly, you may also consider notifying individuals as a way of mitigating harm. For example, if a data breach affects the passwords and user IDs related to the affected individuals, you may send out a communication to them encouraging them to change their passwords. Where financial data is concerned in a breach, you may ask the individual to contact their bank and also have their passwords changed in that regard. When mitigating harm to the individual, you may also offer things like credit monitoring checks and ID theft monitoring. The GDPR requires that in some cases you have to notify an incident to the supervisory authority, to data subjects, and in the case where a processor has been affected by a breach, they have to notify the controller without undue delay. When I say supervisory authority, I mean the relevant data protection regulator. So, for example, in the UK, that would be the ICO. I'm not going to go through this table in detail, but essentially what it sets out are the data breach notification requirements under the GDPR. when the notification requirements kick in, the timing in which you need to notify, and any exceptions to notifying. It's also worth noting that in addition to these breach notification requirements, as a data controller, you may be subject to local law requirements which require notification. You may also need to notify other regulators depending on the sector in which you operate and the personal data you're dealing with, such as the Financial Conduct Authority. And in addition to the GDPR, you may need to notify under other legal regimes, such as the NIS directive. There may also be a contractual obligation to notify a breach to somebody, including your insurers. In other cases, you may wish to preempt notification to a third party, especially where you think someone else may notify them. Now, with this stage where we look at remediation, this has some overlap with the steps we take during containment and where we risk mitigate, especially in the context of the risk to the affected individual. But remediation looks at the broader and the more long-term game in terms of the changes that you need to make after having suffered a breach. You may need to review and update security measures. And for this, you may need to actually go to your board to seek budget. You may also need to provide training. This could be training to your whole workforce or just to the employees that perhaps caused the breach. For example, if an employee has inadvertently sent an email to somebody else, or if they have not complied with access controls. In the context of subcontractors that you use, if they have been the ones that are responsible for a breach, you may need to reassess your contractual relationship with them. That could involve tightening up the contracts, it could involve carrying out an audit on their data protection practices, or finding a new third-party subcontractor altogether. Kirsten already touched on internal and external communications earlier on in this presentation. I'm not going to read out the various ways in which these communications could be made or the context in which they could arise. Instead, I'm going to give you some key takeaways when it comes to communications. The most important thing is that everyone involved in the incident needs to understand what is going on. For example, what data has been affected and what steps are being taken to deal with the incident. They must be properly informed, and the messages that they give out, be it to affected individuals, to the press, have to be consistent. In our experience, we have had an instance where the regulator telephoned our client after our client notified a breach. This is something that we don't always see, and it did take our client by surprise. What would be absolutely helpful in that situation is if the individual was fully appraised of what was going on with the incident, was fully aware of what had been reported to the regulator, so they could adequately and appropriately answer these questions so that there aren't any discrepancies in what was filed in the notification and then what the individual has subsequently confirmed with the regulator. This is the last stage of the incident response process, and one that is often overlooked, and it doesn't get equal billing with other steps in the incident response process. It is important at the end of an incident to have a frank conversation with your incident response team to discuss what went well and what could have been improved. After having this discussion, you should then go on to assessing and improving your incident response method and policy. Another way in which you can think about lessons learned is by having a data breach drill where you train your incident response team on each and every step of the incident response process. So the key takeaways here is that you should have a data breach policy in place and a process in place. This process should ideally be something that's been tried and tested and improved. You should also have appropriate security measures in place. Now, we see many circumstances where our clients have appropriate security measures in place, however, they still suffer a breach. Security measures are important in that context, as when you notify, you can actually say, we had all the appropriate security in place and we had the right policy framework in place, which is why we were able to deal with this breach appropriately and cause none or very minimal harm to the affected individuals. You should also remember that this obligation is ongoing, and this relates to the broader GDPR requirements that Kirsten mentioned earlier on in this presentation that all underpin and tie in with the data breach notification requirements. Lastly, accountability is key. How you deal with a breach and document that process and show compliance with various components of the GDPR would really assist when it comes to a regulator assessing how well you've done in dealing with a particular breach. An item to note here is that when you notify a breach to the regulator, if you don't have appropriate security measures in place, what you will essentially do in the process of making that notification is highlight that to the regulator, and having inadequate security measures in place is in itself an additional breach of the GDPR. By the end of this session, you should now be better able to understand the breach notification requirements, understand the importance of having an incident response process in place, and how to deal with an incident.
Thank you, Sabba. Well, that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you for joining us. And if you do have any questions that you want to follow up on, please do get in contact with us, and our contact details are here for you.